This week, Trump signed an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, an order aimed at eliminating what President Trump calls improper ideology from the American historical narrative, including at our museums, national parks, and monuments. The executive order reads in part, over the past decade, Americans have witnessed a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. Our nation's unparalleled legacy of advancing liberty, individual rights, and human happiness is reconstructed as inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, or otherwise irredeemably flawed. The order focuses on the Smithsonian and claims that the museum system's telling of America's history is a, quote, distorted narrative. The Smithsonian is made up of 21 museums and a national zoo. It's the largest museum complex in the world. Most of the museums are located in Washington, D.C., along the National Mall. The order also directs Vice President J.D. Vance, who is on the Smithsonian's board, to work with Congress to withhold funding from exhibits or programs that, quote, divide Americans by race. And it singles out the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it prohibits the Women's History Museum from undertaking measures that, quote, recognize men as women in any respect. Within the Smithsonian museums, of course, there are countless exhibits that acknowledge our national achievements, our innovations, our American ingenuity, and our greatness. And there are also exhibits that acknowledge the dark or uglier aspects of our history, darker truths about American history, the parts of our past that are sometimes difficult to look at, things like slavery, like Jim Crow segregation, like the devastation of Native American people and culture. As uncomfortable as it may be to acknowledge the darker parts of our history, we cannot possibly celebrate our achievements without an honest reckoning of our mistakes. America is strongest when acknowledging all aspects of our history, the good and the bad and the complex. And yet President Trump and his allies want to narrow American history to look solely at whatever it is they deem to be our greatness. Only allowing a selective history to be told will not make us smarter, more united, or stronger. Erasing our history is a form of larceny, and stealing our history from us hurts all of us. Joining me now to discuss President Trump's decision to target the Smithsonian Museum is Martha S. Jones, professor of history at Johns Hopkins University and author of several important books, including her newest, The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. Jones also served as an advisor to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Also with us is Chandra Manning. She's a professor of history at Georgetown University. She is the author of Troubled Refuge, Struggling for Freedom in the Civil War. Thanks to both of you for being with us to discuss this very important matter. I'm going to begin with you, Martha. This Trump executive order claims that the histories told at places like the Smithsonian's African American History Museum will, quote, deepen societal divides and foster a sense of national shame. What do you make of this kind of rhetoric that seems to make a case that acknowledging or examining the darker parts of our history will somehow make America more divided and more weak?
The first thing to say is that those words could only be uttered by someone who has never spent time in the Smithsonian's, has never spent time in the galleries, whether it's with school groups or families or dignitaries, national and international, because when you spend time in the Smithsonian galleries, what you appreciate are the ways in which the exhibition, the interpretation, the programming, and more is a catalyst for extraordinary discussion across all kinds of difference, across all kinds of understandings and misunderstandings. So I think it reflects perhaps the administration's failure to actually engage with the institutions that they have now targeted. At the same time, I think it just underestimates Americans. It underestimates our ability to think critically, to debate one another when debate is called for, to synthesize the many kinds of histories that make up American history. I think Americans are more than capable of confronting hard histories in many places, including in the halls of the Smithsonian's, and come out still feeling themselves to be Americans.
Chandra, this is, of course, contextualized by the overall effort to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI programs or practices, not just within the government, but throughout American life. And there's a broad assumption that this is something that will primarily impact people of color, people who are disabled, people who are underrepresented in various institutions. But why should every American be alarmed about the idea of trying to create a museum system where Americans tell itself not a fuller story, but a much more narrow story about who we are as a country and where we've been?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for putting the question that way, because it's not a question of trying to tell a positive or a negative story. It's a question of telling a false story when we leave out the people who make up our past. And all of us should be concerned about erasing the parts of our past that create the history that really helps to define all of us. There is no moment in the past that is devoid of people of color or devoid of women. There's no moment where all Americans agreed with each other. There's no moment in the past where there was no conflict. And all of us have a real stake in telling and hearing and thinking about that full story. And I really want to underscore what Professor Jones said about not underestimating Americans' ability and appetite for this fuller story. Americans not only are up to it, I think they genuinely want to know history and not a fairy tale.
And we should note that the National Museum of African American History and Culture is the second most visited museum within the Smithsonian institutions. It's one of the most visited museums in the United States and even in the entire world. Martha Jones, you run a program at Johns Hopkins called Hard History at Hopkins, and it examines the role that discrimination and racism have played at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins, in this case, is looking at itself and in the wider city of Baltimore. Why is it important to look at this kind of thing, look at hard histories, look at the complexities in our histories for a city like Baltimore, but also for a country like America?
Well, what we found at Johns Hopkins is that as we have unearthed our history, as research has led us to new insights about our past, including the past of our founder, that it has galvanized and strengthened us as an institution on the one hand, which is to say that we have done a great deal of important work when, as Professor Manning suggests, we moved away from myths and we got down to our mission, our commitment, I think one we share with the Smithsonian's, which is to frank and unflinching research on the one hand. But at the same time, what it allowed us to do at Johns Hopkins was to embrace this broader swath of our local community here in Baltimore City, a city with its own troubled history with respect to race and racism, and to welcome people into conversations that are hard, that are critical, that are new to many folks. But my experience here, because like the Smithsonian's, we are here for the long haul, my experience is that our community and the fabric of our city is only strengthened by that intelligent, thoughtful, and critical engagement with the past.
When we think about American history, it's often defined by revolutions. But we are, as a country, also defined by our evolutions, by the way we have changed. And it seems like it's harder to appreciate the world that we've inherited if we don't understand the complexities of the past. Chandra Manning, in a comment you made to the Washington Post, you said that, I was going to quote this to you, the executive order seems to suggest that if we allow anyone to hear the whole story of challenges that Americans have overcome, our nation will shatter. The American people are not so fragile as that. Is it important also to remember that, Professor Manning, that we're not just talking about African American history or Native American history, but we're also talking about the way certain immigrant populations from Europe were treated when they came here, the way women had to fight for the right to vote. All of these are evolutions that have created the world that we now live in, and don't we need to understand that?
I think we do. I think if everything was all perfect from the get-go, then there's not much of a story to tell. Then there's not much to understand about how people have come together to face and argue about and disagree about and overcome in the past. Nobody's story is well served if we iron out or erase the bumps and the wrinkles along the way. And the reason why I don't think Americans will fall apart if they hear this story is because of the time that I've spent listening to questions from students in my classrooms, because of the times that I've spent with K through 12 teachers doing professional development, bringing to me the questions their students bring to them. And because of the time I spent as a National Park Service ranger, listening to the questions of visitors on their vacations who want to know. They understand that people are complex and complicated creatures, and it just doesn't ring true to them that there was ever a time in the past where everybody was perfect and got along and had no disagreements. That just doesn't ring true to them.
I'm sitting here in Washington right now, not far from the Smithsonian. It's a time of year where a lot of students are here on spring break. The museums are full of people. It's a much beloved institution. I suspect the White House is going to hear from a lot of people who really enjoy the Smithsonian as it is today. Thank you both for being with us this Sunday morning. Appreciate it.